Hello once again, it's Fritzian, back with another update for RWBY Volume 8 from a writer's perspective. If you have not yet, I'd recommend you watch the first few episodes in this series. We're already almost halfway through the plot, so jumping into this view right now would leave you surely confused. Anyways, we're back here, and let's get going. Part 2G, Episode 7. Episode 7, War, begins with Grimm advancing on the city while Atlas soldiers and mechs brace to defend it. It focuses on a single soldier who's shuddering and breathing heavily in fear. What a fantastic way to demonstrate the human side of the struggle. Even though these soldiers are, assumedly, willing to fight and die for their kingdom, it doesn't change the fact how terrifying it would be to stare down an endless horde of monsters coming right for you. It's those little things that really help sell the human element of Remnant. However, how and why were Atlas's soldiers already in battle formation when Salem arrived? The Grimm were taking down Atlas's shield took everyone by surprise, and getting all those soldiers, fortifications, entrenchments, and military hardware set up is not something that you can just snap your fingers and have done immediately. The only logical explanation I can see here is that Ironwood had these men set up in battle formation the entire time since Salem has appeared, which, while not impossible, seems extremely impractical when you have no idea when or where Salem would strike. All you'd be doing is tiring out your soldiers for when the battle does actually begin. That never becomes an issue though, of course. This is RWBY we're talking about. Besides, in that case, if Salem were smart, she would just set Monstra down on the opposite side of the city, if not within the city itself. As far as we know, she's not limited in where or how Monstra flies, so what exactly stops her from doing that? But who am I kidding? Salem clearly couldn't be bothered to take the 10 extra seconds to have Monstra land somewhere Ironwood didn't have his troops set up. Because remember everybody,
it's a cartoon!
On that note, is there a reason why Salem would rather waste time throwing Grimm at Atlas's defenses rather than having Monstra flood the city with Grimm goo? As I mentioned in the last episode, we're told that Monstra is effectively immune to most of Atlas's weapons, so there would be literally nothing stopping her from blanking the city in Grimm and using that ensuing chaos to get the staff. You could argue that she's stalling for time for Penny to open the vault for her, but even Watts didn't know how long it would take. If that was part of her plan, why not wait until Penny was already at or on the way to the vault? The only thing attacking now does is leave Monstra vulnerable for the Protagonists to counterattack. I recognize that I just said that most of Atlas's weapons can't harm Monstra, but some of them can. The bomb is supposedly capable of doing so, meaning Salem's assault here only increases the risk that her plan could fail for no real reason. Man, Ironwood and Salem really do be out here competing to see who's the dumbest commander. But the bigger problem here is the assumption that Salem's plan involved waiting for Penny in the first place. Even granting the idea that Penny getting hacked was part of the original plan that was just never conveyed to us, which it clearly wasn't given Ironwood is the one who initiates Penny being hacked. Salem had already written off Watts as no longer useful until some unspecified point shortly before the shield was taken down, meaning she, presumably, already had a contingency plan in mind before the invasion actually happened. Mighty convenient that the conflicts in Salem's plan is immediately resolved before it ever becomes a plot-significant issue. Anyways, Monstra lifts up its head and vomits out a pool of Grimm, which spawns various types to assault the city. So I'm not going to get a better time to talk about this, so we're doing it here. I know that Monstra being able to summon Grimm has precedent for it. The Wyvern from Volume 3 was established as being able to spawn Grimm from itself as well. However, the issue, in my opinion, stems, shockingly, from the lack of a meaningful explanation of this Grimm pool and its limitations, and to a lesser extent, Grimm themselves. Grimm spawning from these pools was first demonstrated in Volume 3 from the Wyvern Grimm, and then confirmed in the opening of Volume 4. Yet, all this time later, we've yet to be given a real explanation on how these spawning mechanics work. Does spawning Grimm drain an equal amount of mass from the pool? If that's the case, then it's a finite resource that Salem is just burning for extremely poor reason. More generally, wouldn't that mean there's a finite amount of Grimm that could ever exist on Remnant, and every killed Grimm is infinitely less replaceable than a human or Faunus killed, in terms of manpower? But on the other hand, if Grimm are able to spawn infinitely, then why is Salem pumping out so much of it in one concentrated spot, rather than spreading it as much territory as possible? Does Monstra have a storage tank of sorts for this goo, or can it produce it on its own? I know this may seem like a completely esoteric issue, but the reason I'm drawing attention to it is because how these pools work is crucial to understanding the stakes of this battle. If spawning Grimm requires an equivalent amount of goo, it's possible for Salem to completely run out of Grimm to throw at Atlas, thus making her entire siege a waste of time and resources, or would require her to actually get off her ass and do something herself, but we all know that's not going to happen. But on the other hand, if the pools can spawn Grimm indefinitely, then it's impossible to justify Atlas's military surviving as long as it does, because the more goo Monstra spits out, the amount of Grimm spawning would, theoretically, rise exponentially. If Monstra can produce this goo, does it follow the law of equivalent exchange, or can it create goo from nothing? If it can be produced infinitely, then where's the tension? Salem has an infinite army facing off against a mortal one with limited resources and manpower that's already thinly stretched as it is. Surely then, it would be impossible to beat Monstra without some sort of Deus Ex. All this battle is meaningless noise that will last exactly as long as the writers needed to, regardless of the surrounding context of the show or the world as a whole. To hopefully give a more illustrative example of what I mean here, let's take a detour to talk about the Battle of Hoth from Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. For those of you who have never seen it or don't recall, the Battle of Hoth is a protracted evacuation of the rebel base on the aforementioned Hoth. Long before the first AT-AT walkers are ever deployed, the stakes are already clearly established.
General, there's a fleet of Star Destroyers coming out of hyperspace in Sector 4.
Reroute all power to the energy shield. Gotta hold them till all transports are away. Prepare for ground assault.
The rebels are alerted to our presence. Admiral Ozzel came out of light speed too close to the system.
He felt surprised was wiser.
He is as clumsy as he is stupid. Make ready to land our troops beyond their energy field, then deploy the fleet so that nothing gets off the system. You are in command now, Admiral Piet.
Thank you, Lord Vader.
To bring this back to the Battle of Atlas though, it would be like if the Empire entered orbit around Hoth, sat there for another day without doing anything, the rebels started infighting for stupid reasons, and then when the Empire did attack, they immediately blew up the shield generator from orbit, but still decided to drop the AT-ATs, instead of bombarding them from orbit. The AT-ATs have an unlimited supply of stormtroopers inside of them, countered only by one rebel snowspeeder, and yet the rebels would still win because Luke uses the Force to blow up all the AT-ATs out of nowhere. The extra funny thing about this comparison is that the Empire does make a mistake in this battle by alerting the rebels of their presence too early, which is a mistake that Vader kills someone for.
Lord Vader, the fleet has moved out of light speed and we're preparing to...
You have failed me for the last time, Admiral. You are in command now, Admiral Piet.
Thank you, Lord Vader.
But getting back to the episode, it then cuts to Ironwood as he frustratedly oversees the battle. He then issues an evacuation order for all of Mantle's citizens to go to the subways, while dispatching Mantis Squad Omega to every part of the city. The soldier on the other line briefly protests, but Ironwood slams his fist on the table and screams, "Now!" It cuts to a shot from the city as Ironwood's voice broadcasts his evacuation message. The citizens begin to panic and flood their way to the subway stations as a young girl points out the approaching horde of Lancers, before being grabbed by her father. So here's a question. Why don't Grimm ever seriously try entering the subway tunnels here? We clearly see a swarm of Lancers already within city limits at the time of the evacuation, and it's not unlikely that non-avian Grimm, especially burrowing species like the Sentinels or the Centaurs, could easily make their way inside. Like, think about it. The city of Atlas's entire civilian population is being crammed into a handful of congested subway terminals for their safety. People are panicked, scared, fearful, and suffering from all kinds of intense negative emotions. This alone indicates that the subways should be lit up like lighthouses for the Grimm, akin to the beginning of the Battle of Beacon. Seriously, Grimm being drawn to negative emotions is like one of the two concrete things we actually know about them, and yet such a problem is never even given a passing consideration from the writers. As far as we're ever shown, there's no indication that these subways are any more fortified than those in the real world. How effective could they be against a particularly determined horde of Grimm, which are known for what again?
First and foremost, the Grimm exclusively attack humans and their creations.
Even without those things in consideration, the show has already had to whack everyone with a stupid bat, pull out Deus Ex Machinas, and contradict its own lore and setup just to make it even slightly possible for the heroes to save all the civilians here. Only emphasizing my earlier criticisms of Salem's invasion / the Battle of Atlas broadly, being in a logically low-stakes, artificial conflict that, by the show's own logic, should be nothing short of a slaughter. This once again begs the question of why Salem didn't just coat the entire city with Grimm goo. Alongside the prior issues about its mechanics that I explained earlier, Salem would be aware that doing so would necessarily force Ironwood to stretch out his already thinly stretched military even further in order to defend the civilians. Meaning, not only does flooding the city make more sense from a tactical perspective, it clearly fits into Salem's modus operandi while posing practically zero risk of Monstra being destroyed versus the tiny risk that beaching it has. The fact that these issues are never addressed speaks either to the writers overlooking this as a possibility in the first place, or were so dead set on the plot that they had already decided on and ignored it altogether. Whichever one it is, it doesn't make it any less of an issue. Since I've already expressed my fair share of criticism of this battle, allow me to offer an alternative and use this as an opportunity to go more into detail about what I mean when I describe this conflict as being artificial in nature. So let's start with that. Establishing conflict in a story can be deceptively difficult, even for experienced writers. In his book, The Idea, The 7 Elements of a Viable Story for Screen, Stage, or Fiction, Eric Bork describes 3 common mistakes writers tend to have regarding conflict. the story begins too late in the script, the scenes are void of meaningful conflict, or the conflict is inconsequential or a flash in the pan as he describes it. Funnily enough, all three things apply here to Volume 8. Saving the second point for last, the main plot of the volume doesn't really start until the episode that Salem begins her invasion, i.e. episode 7 of 14. As I've already ranted about multiple times at this point, Salem does nothing but sit on her ass for nearly half the volume, and Ironwood effectively does nothing outside of forcing Watts to hack Penny, which happens in episode 5, and then makes himself the big bad with his bomb threat immediately after Montro is killed in episode 10. There are other things that happen before these two things, of course, but those things aren't the main conflict of the volume. Put in another way, if I were to ask you what the main conflict of Volume 8 was, would you tell me it's the division between the heroes, facing off against the Hound, getting Amity up? No, of course you wouldn't. You would say it's Salem's invasion of Atlas, Ironwood's descent into villainy, or maybe a combination of both. That's because those other minor conflicts only exist insofar as they aid or hinder the heroes in solving the real conflicts. Which neatly segues into the third common issue. What it means for a conflict to be a flash in the pan here is to say that they are extremely brief and or they have no greater impact on the story at large. Or in other words, the stakes behind these conflicts are way too low. I've already described in detail how the divisions amongst the heroes is set up and then completely dropped. The Hound is clearly a threat, yeah, but once it's killed, there's no real change to RWBY's status quo. Save for the fact that now we know that Salem can make Grimm hybrids and that she's using silver-eyed warriors to do so. It's a big shakeup for the lore, sure, but it has no bearing on the progression of Volume 8. And as I talked about in the last episode, outside of Penny being hacked, which could have happened anywhere, the only thing the Amity conflict resulted in was RWBY spreading the word about Salem, Ironwood, and the like. Just like with the Hound, it has substantial implications for the world as a whole, but nothing for the plot. So much so that we never see it or Maria and Pietro again for the rest of the volume, as previously mentioned. To circle back to the Battle of Atlas itself, what makes it inconsequential is the fact that it ends with Oscar blowing up Monstro, something which the battle in and of itself has no bearing on. If one were to cut the whole thing from the volume altogether, you'd still have the plot thread of Yang's team infiltrating Monstro to save Oscar. All it would take is a minor tweak to the script to change the specific plot points that lead to Yang's team breaching Monstro in the first place. Other than that, the entire volume would more or less play out the exact same way, which, if my tone isn't good enough to indicate, is not a good thing for your conflict to come off as, especially when it's supposed to be the ticking time bomb that forces your protagonist to act. Finally, to lack meaningful conflict is to say that the obstacles that the characters face in order to achieve their goals have no intrinsic difficulty. But what does that actually mean? Well, think of it like this. If you put yourself in the shoes of the characters facing the conflict, are there simple and clear solutions to their problems that the character would reasonably do based on their knowledge of the situation and their personalities? If you were Ironwood, would you sally out your entire army in one battle line when your enemy has an aerial mobile force? Remember what I explained earlier. The shield being taken down caught everyone, and particularly Ironwood, off guard, and Monstro beached itself immediately afterwards. It's impossible for Alice's forces to already have been mobilized in time to face the Grimm unless they were already in position when Monstro beached itself. On the other hand, if you were Salem, would you focus your mobile, aerial, and practically infinite forces on the only position that your enemy has fortified when, honestly, even setting that all aside, you could just have Monstro bulldoze the entire city uncontested? No, you probably wouldn't. That's where the problem lies. The only difficulties in this battle are, again, the result of both Salem and Ironwood being whacked with a stupid bat. Or maybe this is just another case of metal in action for Ironwood.
Don't make me tap the sign.
But expanding upon that, the situation itself does not naturally lead to the conflict we see. It's one that arises from the writers forcing their hand. Going back to the Battle of Hoth comparison, the decision to begin the evacuations of Hoth after the probe droid was discovered is sensible when their options are either that, or gamble that the probe didn't get a message out to the Empire, and/or they wouldn't investigate any further. Time is of the essence, after all. On the other hand, the Empire sending a massively disproportionate fleet to this system is consistent with the Empire's goals to stamp out the rebellion in its entirety. You could make the case that the Empire's mistake here is a level of artificiality for the conflict. However, I would argue that tactical mistakes do happen a lot in war, but where this differs from the mistakes made by Ironwood and Salem, this is explicitly addressed in the story and has direct consequences for the one at fault. Due to these points, the audience having no understanding of how Grimm goo works on a practical level, the mechanisms by which Monstro spits it out, the tactics employed by both sides, a central piece of world building being ignored for no apparent reason, and knowing from the benefit of hindsight that the battle only ends because of a deus ex machina, this whole conflict is, just as I described earlier, meaningless noise that will last exactly as long as it needs to and nothing more. So let's fix that, shall we? And come a little closer, there's a lot to see. There, that's better. Firstly, to address the problems associated with the Grimm goo, I'm defining its mechanics as follows. The goo can spawn Grimm infinitely. However, when it's spread outside of regions affected by the God of Darkness, it will evaporate away at a steady rate, and thus proportionally decrease the rate of Grimm being spawned. As well, we're going to say that Monster does have the ability to generate goo over time, and that Monster has a massive internal storage tank that was filled up at the start of the invasion. However, the rate by which Monster produces it is substantially and noticeably slower than the rate that the tank is being drained. That way, Salem maintains her numerical superiority over Atlas, while also making it possible for her to suffer from attrition without diminishing the overall threat that Grimm poses to humanity. Also, instead of Monster being practically unkillable, we'll say it's just extremely durable and is escorted by other Grimm for protection. Regarding the initial setup of forces, instead of being lined up outside the city's fortifications, Ironwood will place his troops on the wall. That way, he'll maintain a strong defensible position to offer resistance from, without leaving his men exposed or causing inflexibility and congestion should he need to redeploy somewhere else in the city if necessary. You know, like what walls are specifically designed to do. This will come with corresponding design changes that better suit that function, cause come on, look at this thing. Why would Atlas engineers design and build a wall that's so thin that even a single Goliath could breach it with a charge? It might as well not even be there. Also, how the hell did these troops even get up there in the first place, and how are they supposed to get down? Again, the incompetence of the Atlas military never ceases to baffle me, and begs the question how they managed to survive this long to begin with.
12 months have passed. Let's go fight Saiyans. Oh God, it's the Saiyans! Hi. Yamcha's here. Yamcha's dead!
But that's besides the point. We'll say that these walls are wide enough for a paladin to stand on top of, and for troops to go around when necessary, and possess hard-light walls to give them cover. Then we're going to replace these purely aesthetic pillars with towers that actually can support artillery platforms, and staircases for troops to go inside the walls, as well as safely going up and down. Although it hasn't been depicted in the show, to my recollection, Amity Arita confirms that Atlas has artillery in the form of the Atlegian beam cannon, and its card info indicates that an additional 50 lasers were ordered by Ironwood following the fall of Beacon. Remember, not only are the card infos canon, the game itself exists within the canon as well, so we'll assume that these cannons will be placed along regular intervals. Tacked onto these increased fortifications, we're also going to assume that the subway terminals do in fact have armor akin to the Argus Limited. Lastly, there needs to be a network that allows troops and other armaments to traverse to other points of the walls without having to navigate through the city. Perhaps expanding on these? While we don't know what they actually are, their placement leads me to believe that there's some sort of rail network. Rolling with that, we'll say that an analogous network runs inside the walls and connects to the subway networks as such. Phew! With that established, we can finally start the battle proper. Before the shield is taken down, Ironwood deploys most of his troops to concentrate along the western wall of the city to oppose Salem. In the skies above, the fleet is arranged in a defensive formation to act as a check on Salem's aerial forces. Suddenly, without warning, the Grimm River bursts from below and rapidly takes down the hardlight shields. The horde begins to advance, with many of the faster aerial Grimm entering the city with relative ease. Monster, however, due to its sheer size, moves much slower than the rest of the Grimm. However, it dumps out a massive volume of goo from its maw near the city limits, and more begins to leak out as it crawls ahead. Ironwood responds by immediately ordering his men to open fire and, like in the cannon, orders the evacuation of the city into the subways. The sheer panic and fear this inevitably causes begins to draw in Grimm to the subways, but thanks to their deployable armor, it's able to fend off the Grimm for the time being. Along the western front, the cannons rain down hell upon the Grimm. In the air, the fleet advances to be in range of their guns and deploys their fighters as a screening force. Then, to everyone's horror, Monster does not stop at the walls, and almost casually starts to circle above the city and the base, thoroughly marinating it entirely. Although this more quickly drains Monster's storage capacities, it's counteracted by the fact that the Grimm funnel themselves towards the civilians. This forces the fleet to break formation as to not be overrun by Monster and its escorts. The airships are able to damage it, but Monster's sheer durability and their inability to concentrate fire on it diminishes the effectiveness of doing so. Ironwood then orders all ground forces into the subways to set up defensive perimeters around the civilians. Unfortunately for them, this mass retreat drastically reduces their ability to hold back the Grimm beyond the walls, causing massive casualties from Grimm climbing onto, digging under, or punching through the walls uncontested. And look at that! With a handful of changes, we've arrived at the Battle of Atlas, with Salem having divided and cornered the Atlas military in a way that fits her preferred strategies and puts an immediate, meaningful timer on the battle, while either side has a plausible chance of failure. Will the military be able to hold out long enough for Ironwood and or the heroes to succeed, or will Salem run out of goo before securing the Staff of Creation? These are the type of questions you want your audience to be asking once the battle gets going, and not, why are Salem and Ironwood leading their forces like this? You might ask in this scenario scenario why Ironwood doesn't begin the evacuation by fortifying the shelters, knowing that Montreal can and will likely fly over the walls. My response to that is that ceding ground up front undermines his ability to stall Salem for as long as possible. It also would hamper his ability to respond in the scenario that Montreal just dumps all of its goo over the base itself and quickly overruns it. That being said, if you have an issue with my version of the battle for that reason, I hope you would recognize that the canon version is exponentially worse in that regard. Not like it's any easier to move troops around to the civilians or the base while being forced to funnel everyone through the narrow gates of the walls, travel to the opposite ends of the city, and up the mountain that the base is situated on top of. It's just an unavoidable problem so long as Montreal A is able to fly and B can spawn Grimm wherever Salem chooses. Either way, I think I've made my point clear, and we've barely even begun the episode, so let's move on. It cuts then to Winter's ship, where John, Yang, and Ren are in custody. Over intercom, an engineer explains to Ironwood that the hard light shields can't be repaired. Ironwood tells him not to waste resources on it then, and then asks Beta Squad for their status. The commander explains that nothing they throw at Monster is working. Winter then radios in, updating him on Penny still being MIA and that she has John, Ren, and Yang in custody. Ironwood orders her to stand by and not to let the fugitives out of her sight. Yang scoffs and remarks how Winter is still just following orders. They all then look in shock as Monster is seen reeling. John sheepishly says that that's where the Hound took Oscar, and that it's bigger than he thought. Vine responds that Grimm don't take prisoners, but Yang snaps back saying that this one did. She tries to stand, asking to be let go as Vine and Elm hold her back. Ironwood then radios back, telling Mantis Squad to focus on smaller Grimm, as Command is working on a plan for Monstra. Winter asks what he has in mind, to which Ironwood explains that while attacking from the outside is not working, it likely could be vulnerable from the inside. He continues that the science team is building a bomb that she and the Aesops will escort on foot. Winter is shocked, but she affirms that she'll get it done. John then butts in that Oscar's still in there as Yang attempts to stand again and declares that they can't do that. It briefly shows Winter's hand shaking before she clenches her fist. So how did Yang and the others hear Ironwood's orders? Did Winter give them an earpiece for the secure Atlas comms? Over soft piano music, we see Salem orchestrating Monstra to coalesce and churn out pools of Grimm. The music here is a great choice, as the serenity of it puts us in Salem's head as she's sending out the Grimm, especially as it juxtaposes against the terror Atlas is feeling right now. It then pans over to Emerald, watching from near the entrance of the throne room. Confirming that Salem is distracted, she walks off. She nearly encounters a seer, but uses her semblance to hide from it. Okay. How exactly does that work? As established multiple times in the past, Emerald's semblance only creates visual illusions, and Grimm don't see people that way. They see people purely through their emotions, as demonstrated multiple times through the use of Ren's semblance. Even if someone is visible to regular people, when masked by Ren, they disappear from the eyes of Grimm. Turning herself invisible wouldn't stop her emotions from being visible to the seer, or is that just another thing her semblance can do now? Emerald's semblance is already one of, if not the most powerful semblances in the show, and now thanks to her off-screen training, can now apparently mask herself from Grimm, and more as we'll see later. Even putting all of that aside, the seer absolutely would have seen her when Emerald decloaked about 10 feet away from it. Regardless, it then shows Emerald approaching the room where Hazel is torturing Oscar. It cuts inside, with Oscar hanging from a hook on the wall. Blood drips off of him, and Hazel tells him that stunt you pulled, she'd kill you if you didn't pop up somewhere else. Still, you can make things easier on yourself if you started telling the truth. With Ospen still in control, he asks Hazel if he's ever thought about why she recruited him specifically. Hazel explains that they share a vision, and that she's going to create a new world order, one without kingdoms, or most notably for him, no huntsman academies. Ospen laughs to himself, telling Hazel that when Salem gets all the relics, Remnant will be destroyed. Hazel steps away to think, as Ospen explains that Salem's been alive longer than he can comprehend, and that all she craves now is release. Hazel punches Ospen in the gut and demands him to stop lying. As Ospen's vision goes blurry, Hazel says that Salem can't be killed, explaining how he killed her over and over again, and how she was only gone for at most a few hours. He adds that when he couldn't lift his arms up anymore, Salem showed him that with her, he could have the revenge he needed. Ospen then asserts that that's why Salem came for him, that she could easily convince him that this is what he needed. Hazel then cries out this is what Ospen deserves. Ospen agrees with Hazel about himself, but then asks about Oscar, the people of Atlas, and Remnant altogether. He then states that Hazel hasn't done this for justice, but rather for himself, because Salem pushed him into thinking that this would help him. Then ends by bluntly asking Hazel if it really has helped him. I want to take this scene to explain the issues I have with the show's insistence on underutilizing show, don't tell. To get this out of the way immediately, for those who may not know, show, don't tell is another commonly discussed writing technique, in which the story gets across all the necessary information to the audience by showing it to them through action, rather than just telling the audience about it. Because, no matter how good your dialogue to explain that information is, it will never be as impactful as demonstrating the practical effects of that information within the story itself. I'm sure most of you have heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words before, right? It's the same principle here. Taking this scene as an example, there are 3 pieces of new information that this scene is trying to explain to the audience. The first is that Salem's motivation for gathering the relics is so she can finally die. that Salem can only be killed for a few hours at most, and the third being that Hazel chose to follow Salem because he believed it would help him get the vengeance he needed, with a greater emphasis on the latter. While this scene does certainly get that information across, let's imagine a hypothetical alternative version of this scene. After Osmond asks Hazel if he knows why Salem chose him, it cuts to a flashback of Hazel trying to convince Gretchen not to go to Beacon, but Osmond convinced her to go anyway. It would then cut to him finding out that Gretchen was killed. We'd see him mourn at her funeral, Osmond being callous about her death, and when a broken Hazel tries to find out why she died, Osmond doesn't answer, or dismisses him out of hand. Hazel, enraged, tries to attack Osmond, but Osmond and/or Glenda, as I imagine she would be there as well, defeat him and leave him bloodied and alone, scoring bonus angst points if it's raining. You could then have Salem arrive, showing pity for him, and philosophize how Hazel is a wounded man in need of guidance. Hazel could then reject her, saying there isn't anything anyone could do to get back Gretchen, with Hazel saying something along the lines of, "No force on Remnant could take down Osmond and the Huntress Academies." Salem could retort with something along the lines of, "How about a force of nature?" and then compelling Hazel to let his rage out on her. Hazel could then kill Salem over and over again, only to see her come back each time. When he's too exhausted to keep fighting, Salem could extend her offer again, which Hazel then accepts. For added effect, you could lightly sprinkle in parts of Hazel and Osmond's argument over the flashback. Obviously, I had the benefit of hindsight when drafting this scene, but I believe it would do a better job of conveying the same necessary information than the official version does, as well as doing a better job of demonstrating Salem's manipulation tactics, gives a face, and possibly a personality depending on how far they're willing to lead into it, to Gretchen, would be able to demonstrate her relationship with Hazel, why Hazel is willing to go to such extremes for revenge, and characterizing Osmond as that morally gray character they desperately want us to believe he is. Granted, this wouldn't really be able to show Salem's motivation for gathering the relics, and it would be much more expensive to produce. Though personally, even though I believe that information was heavily implied from Salem's backstory, I would argue that the positives outweigh the negatives here. Regardless of the fact that Hazel dies in 2 episodes, a scene akin to the one I just described would give more weight to his sacrifice. All we ever get of Hazel's backstory are 2 exposition dumps that, while getting the general idea across, are hard to empathize with.
Gretchen Reinhardt was Hazel's assistant. Despite her brother's wishes, she enrolled at Beacon Academy to become a huntress, and tragically lost her life on a training mission. Hazel holds me responsible.
We have no context of who Hazel was before Gretchen's death. He's just the big meathead villain who somehow believes that killing millions of people is the best way to get revenge on a single person. Anyways, I've rambled on this point long enough, so let's move on. The episode then cuts to Weiss tending Nora's wounds as she lays in Weiss's bed. She's almost entirely covered in bandages. In her sleep, Nora asks, "Now what good am I for?" Weiss pushes some hair off of Nora's eyes as Blake and Ruby enter, carrying cups of tea. Ruby asks how Nora is doing as she hands Weiss a cup. Weiss says that she's done what she can, but Nora's gonna need a doctor to treat her properly. Blake says she hopes May can contact the others and hopes that they're okay, as it cuts to the window. As she steps towards it, Blake says Mantra is creating Grimm faster than Atlas can kill them, and that the city won't stand a chance unless they can stop it. So looks like this lends more credence to the idea that Grimm can spawn infinitely from the goo, meaning there's no reason why Salem didn't just coat the entire city in it. Ruby states that Mantra is way bigger than a Leviathan and asks what they could even do. If only our protagonist had a special ability tailor-made for dealing with Grimm or something.
If only someone had a secret superpower capable of taking an enemy that big.
Yeah, maybe something related to silver eyes? It could really come in handy right now. Anyone at all?
Susan Vanelli can't do it.
Don't worry, guys. I'm sure the solution will appear when we least expect it.
But for Itzian, Ruby could only partially encase the Leviathan in stone, and Mantra is much larger. She wouldn't be able to destroy it. Firstly, while that might be true, that doesn't mean they should completely ignore bringing it up as an option. Secondly, Ruby's officially known about her silver eyes for 5 volumes now, and has known how they work for 2, yet she seems to be allergic to the idea of actually using them. Sure, it only works in the presence of Grimm, but then why not show Ruby trying to practice with it while she's fighting Grimm in Volume 7 or in Volume 8? The only way she's gonna get better with them in a natural, believable way is through practice. Her silver eyes are easily the most powerful ability they have to face off against Salem, so why does she actively avoid trying to improve with it? All it's ever been in the show is a plot device as a near get-out-of-jail-free card for dealing with Grimm. And Cinder, whenever the writers back themselves into a corner, or is immediately undermined because Rooster Teeth had other plans for defeating said Grimm. Such as Cordovan swooping in 10 seconds after Ruby stunned the Leviathan, or so the silver-eyed faunus underneath the Hound's Grimm parts could be revealed. Which that one I'm not as mad about, as the reveal is much more important than just blasting it away. I have more problems with silver eyes, but since this is already a tangent, I'll come back to it when it becomes more relevant next episode. But for now, Weiss takes a seat by the fire, explaining that Penny got their message out, and wonders if they should wait for someone to come. Ruby then looks down to her teacup as she wonders aloud how things could have ended up like this. May then enters and informs them that Fiona hasn't heard from Yang's group, and that the last thing they're worried about is a couple of kids. May then starts to say that the ship is ready and that they should be going, but Weiss interrupts, saying that they can't leave. This prompts May to say that it's chaos in the crater. She adds that while Atlas has its army, Mantle only has them, and people are dying. Weiss interjects that people are dying in Atlas as well, asking if she has family there. May sternly answers no. She states that Mantle needed her, and that to the Marigolds, it meant she wasn't their son anymore. She then adds that she made sure that everyone knew that she wasn't their daughter. She turns her back to Weiss and crosses her arms, and tells her to forget about it. She then says that theirs have Henry, yours have Whitley, before trailing off with a, you get what I'm saying. While I feel that Weiss's question comes out of nowhere in the context of this conversation, this is an amazing scene for May. I'm not going to speak on the quality of it as trans representation, but at least from a narrative perspective, it clearly demonstrates that information in a way that feels completely natural for her to say, and solidifies to me that she's easily one of the best characters of the Happy Huntresses, if not the volume as a whole. I'd like to add an asterisk to that, however. If the Marigolds had a bigger role in Volume 7 or 8, and there was an established link between her and them before this point, it would make May's line hit so much harder. For one, as far as I could recall or find, May's last name is never mentioned within the show itself, and the Marigolds haven't been a part of the story at all since Volume 4. And even then, it was just Henry, who was in the show for all of 2 minutes. The only reason why people knew there was a connection whatsoever before this scene was because it was confirmed on Twitter. That's not good storytelling, making this a payoff with no setup. Weiss tries to say that she doesn't know about that, but May shouts at her, demanding to know what side they're on. Blake interjects saying they've heard that before. Before May can say anything, RWBY steps in saying that there are no sides, and they're all facing Salem together, and that together is the only way they'll get out of it. May then sighs before asking RWBY how they do get out of it then, before the camera pans out to reveal Whitley eavesdropping from right outside the door. I'm not a big fan of the both sidesing from Blake here. May is being the rational one here, telling them to pick a side and do something. Anything. RWBY's speech about fighting Salem together comes off extremely tone-deaf when they're just lounging around in the Schnee manor, drinking tea and twiddling their thumbs while everyone else is fighting for their lives. Yet the narrative is framed like RWBY and Blake are on the right side here. Even after their argument, RWBY fails to come up with a plan to get everyone to work together and fight back. So how is May wrong here? This is emblematic of a larger issue with the show as a whole, but I'll put a pin in it for now, as it will become more relevant later. But back with Ozpin and Hazel, Ozpin recites Salem's curse to him, adding that she believes that if she divides humanity beyond repair and gathers all the relics, the gods will rule against them and destroy Remnant once and for all. Hazel refuses to believe Ozpin, citing Gretchen's death as a reason for that. Oscar tells Ozpin to let him take over. Ozpin protests, but Oscar says that if he wants Hazel to trust them, Ozpin needs to trust him. They swap, and Oscar reveals the password to the lamp to Hazel, and that she can only answer one more question. Hazel grabs Oscar by the collar and says, after all that, you're just gonna give her the password? Oscar responds saying that he's giving him the password, and hopes that he'll find the truth for himself. Hazel and Emerald, still eavesdropping, are shocked by this. This is another really good scene, one that thematically ties in with the themes of risk and demonstrates Oscar's cleverness and trusting nature. It's scenes like these that remind me how good the show can be when effort's actually put into it. It cuts to Mercury dismissing Emerald about what she just heard, saying that Oscar is a prisoner and he will do anything he can to get out of it. Emerald asks if he's still going to back UO after what she said. Mercury then states that these are Salem's orders, and he knows better not to disobey her. Emerald tries to say something, but Mercury states that even if Ozpin's claims are true, that they can't stop Salem, reminding her that Hazel tried, failed, and got in line, adding that the big guy is not going to pick fights he can't win, and neither should they. Emerald then glares at him as he walks out, casually saying that Salem isn't going to destroy Remnant, but Tyrian interjects saying that she is. He asks if they're surprised before stating that Salem is destruction incarnate, and that she wishes to see the end of it all. He asks them both what could be more beautiful before saying, if you couldn't see that from the start, you must be out of your mind. He then escorts Mercury away, saying they have a date with the desert. Mercury is pushed into a ship as he looks back at Emerald. They share a concerned nod of understanding before the two men fly off. Firstly, I love the "you must be out of your mind" line. But after thinking about it for a little bit, this whole little scene with Tyrian just poses more questions than it answers. Firstly, was he the only member of Team Witch that knew about Salem's endgame? Hazel clearly didn't, and there's no indication whether Watts or Cinder knew. If that's the case, why was he the only one to know? Did she tell him because of his devotion to her? Was it meant to be a secret? If so, why was he so open to admitting it to Emerald and Mercury? If not, why doesn't Hazel already know that? We never get any clarification on those questions, so all we can do is speculate on them. Given how excited Tyrian is about it, I'd imagine it would come up at some point during the years of them working together, and given how quickly that information leads to Emerald, Hazel, and Mercury questioning their loyalties, it seems like a miracle they hadn't already double-crossed Salem by now. In contrast to that scene of Oscar giving Hazel the password, scenes like this just give me the impression that each one was written in a vacuum, and that no one checked to make sure that nothing contradicted anything else. It then cuts to Winter's ship. Yang stands and proclaims that they can't blow it up with Oscar still inside, as Elm and Vine grab her. Vine states that Monster causes more destruction every minute, and they can't wait. John then jumps in, begging for an opportunity to try to save Oscar themselves first, saying they can be the test run. This catches Winter's attention. He continues by saying that they don't know what's going to be inside, and offers to go inside to scout it out while they look for Oscar. Marrow asks if they'll go alone, to which Yang asks if he wouldn't do the same for the other Aesops. Elm then states that they don't let personal feelings get in the way of making the right call, and that trading 3 lives for 1 is stupid. Ren then interjects saying that it's not. They all look to him as he declares that Oscar is their friend, and they will do whatever it takes to find him because they care about him. Harriet gets out of her chair, saying that she had pegged him as being the most level-headed of the group, but then shrugs and concludes that he's just as naive, before declaring that feelings don't matter because it's the job that matters. If you lose someone on your team, you move on and replace them, like Marrow replaced Tortuga and Winter replaced, but Ren stands up and shouts, no, no one is replaceable. He grits his teeth, which then quickly fades into confusion. He sees red flower petals floating up around Harriet. He then states in an almost surprised tone, you don't really believe that. You're furious about losing Clover, and you miss him. This startles Harriet, who lashes out saying he doesn't know anything about her. He looks to the rest of the Aesops. Dark blue petals fall around Marrow, orange petals fly up around Elm, and green ones float around Vine. He then looks down at himself, seeing pink petals falling. He then states, that's why you lost to Team RWBY. You try to fight how you feel about one another, so you'll never truly work as a team. I get the underlying power of friendship message being made here, but I fail to see how that has anything to do with the fight. Not to mention it contradicts how it was actually shown. When fighting the Petrogeist, they're so in sync that John, RWBY, and Nora gush about how well they work together, and yet suddenly they're uncoordinated because of a vague idea of fighting how you feel about each other. Don't get me wrong, they made the whole we're just coworkers not friends thing clear, but that never translates to any issues on the battlefield. It wasn't even a true 4v4, so it's not like they had a real chance to demonstrate Team RWBY just being a more cohesive team than the Aesops. This is why I wanted to clarify earlier that just telling the audience something doesn't always mean what's being told makes sense. Back to the scene, Elm snaps at him to shut up, and that he doesn't know what he's talking about. She winds up to punch him, but Winter intervenes and orders them all to calm down. She thinks for a moment before agreeing to John's plan, and saying they'll drop him off as close to Monster as possible. Harriet says they can't just do that, as they're fugitives and traitors. Winter cuts her off, bluntly stating that she outranks her. Harriet backs off, and Winter tells Yang's team if they aren't out in time, they'll drop the payload no matter what. They're dropped off and given their weapons back. As he leaves, Ren turns to Marrow and states that he doesn't like this either, and that he doesn't want to be part of this at all anymore. Marrow hesitates before stating that he has a job to do, and he will do it. As Winter steps beside him, Ren says, I know you don't either, before seeing a mixture of petal colors around her. I have mixed feelings about this scene as a whole, so I'm going to analyze and parse out the issues in my head. Ren's semblance evolving to be able to read emotions is a believable ability to get, and him using it to read through the lie the Aesops believe about themselves is great, and confirms the hints of doubt that have been shown. And I love seeing all the different colored petals around Winter. It's a fantastic way of visualizing how complicated Winter is feeling without compromising her facade. But on the other hand, I don't think Ren earned it narratively. The long and short of it is that I believe they're trying to tie in Ren's semblance evolving to his character arc, of dealing with his desires to want to grow stronger and not fail again. But it fails to properly link the two ideas together, resulting in a confused mess of overlapping messaging. I initially planned to explain why here, but what I wrote ended up being way too long a tangent for this section. I'll explain further in part 3, but as I'm sure you're used to by now. Back with RWBY's team in the Schnee Manor, RWBY tries suggesting that they can break Robin and Crow out of prison, but May shouts her down, saying, you just don't get it. This is not a situation where everyone wins. She continues saying they can come with her to help Mantle, or she'll drop them off on the front lines to help Atlas. She then states that because Crow and Robin can't save them, they have to be the ones to choose, before begging RWBY to make a choice. Thank the gods for May here. She's the only one in their group who seems to recognize the gravity of their situation, and actually is willing to make a choice here. Before they can answer, there's a knock at the door. Each of the girls ready their weapons as Weiss opens the door, revealing Klein standing there. Weiss perks up upon seeing him, as Klein says he heard about Nora needing medical assistance. Weiss tries to apologize for him being fired, but Klein rejects the apology, saying it has nothing to do with her, and everything to do with Jacques. Weiss asks how he knew about Penny, as Klein greets Whitley, expressing how happy he was when Whitley called, and asks where Nora is. Whitley tells him that she's in Weiss's room, and starts explaining how to get there, as Klein states that he hasn't been gone that long. Weiss asks her brother to confirm if he actually did call Klein. Whitley states that Nora needed a doctor, and that he didn't do it for her. Weiss smiles, saying that she knows, and that's why it means so much to her. She gives him a hug, which he accepts. Klein's always a joy, good to see him again. However, even though Klein having medical experience isn't exactly far-fetched, I just wish him having that skill was established previously. I also really like this moment for Whitley and Weiss respectively. As I stated earlier, Weiss being so hostile to him is something that really aggravated me, so I'm glad to see her actually being a sister to him again. As for Whitley, it's a great way to show that there's still an empathetic person underneath all the brainwashing Jacques instilled into him. Suddenly there's a rumble, followed by a loud crashing noise outside. Weiss asks Whitley if he called anyone else, as RWBY opens the door. She sees a crater on the road with smoke rising out of it. Blake, Weiss, and RWBY rush out to investigate. As the smoke clears, they see a damaged Penny reaching out to them and apologizing before collapsing.
Does anyone want to tell me in what universe Penny or anyone in the Schnee Manor survives that crash?
But Veritzian, she has aura. That would protect her from bodily harm when she impacted. I take that rebuttal, but I raise you. If a couple wires, Cinder's Grimm hand, and a single slice from Adam's sword can slice through aura and cause physical damage at the same time, surely that could happen here just as easily. In fact, Penny being covered in green oil here just proved my point. It's also super convenient that Penny not only landed in Atlas at all, but also next to the only people in Atlas that could actually help her.
When I first saw this scene, I just couldn't get that question out of my head. So be it out of spite or pettiness, I decided to run the numbers and see how much damage such an impact would cause. We're not given much in terms of hard numbers to go off of, so I had to get creative to find those out, or make some assumptions for what I couldn't. If you want to skip the math, jump to this time code. The first thing I tried to find out was the distance that Penny would have fallen between Amity and the Schnee Manor. This is relatively simple to solve using the Pythagorean theorem, as so. Getting our vertical height is the easy part. While Pietro and Maria watch Amity reach broadcasting range, we're shown a height of 543.523. While we're not given units, it's safe to assume it's referring to kilometers, as it's comparable to where satellites in low Earth orbit tend to be. However, Atlas isn't at ground level, and we don't know exactly how high Atlas floats, and since I wasn't sure how exactly I'd go to get a hard number, I decided to chop off about 4.5 kilometers from that. There's no way in hell that Atlas is 4.5 kilometers above ground, but it's a good conservative estimate. For the next part of our triangle, the horizontal distance traveled, I overlaid this map of Atlas and Amity's relative locations from each other from episode 5 onto Firedart's map of Remnant as best as possible, counted the pixels to find the distance in pixels, and assuming that Remnant is the same size as Earth, used this online calculator to roughly find out Remnant's circumference at that latitude. Converted those pixels into kilometers, roughly giving us a horizontal distance of 247.99 kilometers. Plugging those into the Pythagorean theorem, we get our triangle shown here, and the distance that Penny fell being roughly 593.31 kilometers. Now that's our distance sorted out, but what about impact velocity? First off, we need her orbital velocity, as that would be her initial velocity. Using this equation, we get a velocity of 7.594 meters per second. Translating that into impact velocity is beyond me, so I reached out to a friend who's majoring in physics, who whipped out this Excel spreadsheet to crunch the numbers for me, giving us an impact velocity of 6.346 meters per second. Lastly, we need to know Penny's height and density. We know that Penny is 1.65 meters tall, based on the RWBY height chart released way back when. Density, however, I had to assume. Ironically, I guess you could say we don't need to calculate it, as mass no longer matters. Anyways, the show indicated that Penny weighs more than the average person, so I first assumed that her density was that of steels, but I also ran the numbers for both aluminum and the average human body. Then, plugging all the relevant numbers into this calculator, and we're left with these outputs, after converting joules to kilotons. For comparison, the Davy Crockett, the smallest nuclear bomb ever made, is about 0.02 kilotons, almost 4.5 times less powerful than our steel estimate, just under 50% less powerful than our aluminum estimate, and about 20 times greater than our human estimate. If we then plug those yields into Nuke Map, we can roughly see how far the shockwave from Penny's crash would reach, and the level of devastation it would cause. Even looking just at our human estimate for Penny's density, that should have created a shockwave that would demolish the outer walls of the manor, if not more. How can I tell? Well, using this shot from later in the volume, I was able to find out the distance between Penny's impact site and the outer walls of the manor, using emerald as a measuring stick, which gives us a distance of about 17 emeralds or 29-ish meters. However, the radius for moderate damage is about 50 meters, or 29.5 emeralds if that tickles your fancy. Looking at our aluminum and steel estimates though, it's even worse, as the blast radius for the heavy level of damage are 70 and 90 meters, or about 41 and 53 emeralds respectively. Personally, I'd lean more towards the aluminum result, as it's often used in the real world for its high durability for its comparatively lightweight, and I imagine that Pietro and or Ironwood wouldn't want her to be that much heavier than a normal person, especially when we take into account that Penny being a robot was initially kept as a secret. But no matter how you slice it, Penny's crash should have killed practically everyone in that scene, and had a much more devastating impact on the surrounding environment. At least enough to destroy that gaudy lake and monument right next to her impact site. Who am I kidding though? It's not like this is the only time this volume that characters miraculously survived an explosion that should have killed them. Let's just add a point and move on. Actually, wait a minute. I put way too much effort into backing up my argument just for a measly point. There. Much better. It was at about this point of the script when I realized a very valid criticism regarding that last section. Who cares if Penny's crash didn't kill anyone or cause environmental damage? Why are you spending so much time focusing on the realism of the show? RWBY has magic, semblances, and operates off anime logic. Who cares about all of this? They're fair questions to ask, of course, and since this criticism could be levied against a lot of my arguments throughout this review, now's a better time than any to address it. My biggest issue with this argument is that there's a major difference between realism, as how things work in the real world, and holding the show up to its own standards. RWBY does have a lot of fantasy and supernatural elements in its world, however the ways in which those elements alter the world compared to our own is primarily through characters' physical attributes, not the world as a whole. The feats of superhuman strength and speed are limited to trained warriors, and their durability is due to aura. The average run-of-the-mill human or faunus on Remnant can't leap onto buildings from ground level, block bullets, or smash concrete with their weapons, and the scale of these feats correlate heavily with their fighting styles and prior combat history. Take John. Setting aside his above-average aura, he's just a guy. He has yet to display any feat of strength or speed comparable to what practically every other named character in the show has been capable of doing since episode 1, and that's after 8 volumes. More broadly, the physics of Remnant has always basically been the same as ours. Remember, the reason there was a struggle to get Amity up in the first place is because their dust-based technology does not work outside of Remnant's atmosphere, not because the underlying physics of getting things into orbit is drastically different than ours.
The concept of relay satellites orbiting around the planet was promising. Unfortunately, modern man has yet to make the technological advancements required to achieve spaceflight, as all known dust types lose their power as they begin to leave Remnant's atmosphere.
In other words, if we were to somehow magically transfer all of our rocket technology, along with all the associated infrastructure and fuel needed to run them, Remnant could easily have its own satellite network array up and running fairly quickly. They just went down a different industrial tech tree than we did, so to speak. Hell, we even see Penny burning up upon re-entry. Regarding the anime logic, there is a very fuzzy line in terms of what is and isn't excusable, based on the inherent subjective nature of it. I tend to draw it around things that are played around comedic effect, or are otherwise inconsequential to the plot. Nora slurping down an entire jar of tree sap in the time it takes Ren to fill up another jar, or RWBY's head growing exponentially big to laugh at John's pumpkin Pete sweater are things I would chalk up to anime logic. Another example outside of RWBY would be how, in the Dragon Ball universe, damage dealt to the battlefield stays more or less consistent throughout Z and beyond, despite pretty much every character's post-Saiyan saga being planet busters, and how power levels exponentially rise from that point forward. Are they inconsistent with our understanding of how the universe works? Kinda, yeah, but does it really matter? To a degree? But keeping that consistent would mean that basically any fight would immediately cause whatever planet they're on to explode. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that the show has not given me enough reason to justify not comparing Penny's fall, or many other things in the show for that matter, with how analogous things would work in reality. Getting back to the point though, not only are these last 2 scenes perfectly representative of my larger issues, RWBY, Weiss, and Blake's inability to make a choice here is the central factor of the larger issue I alluded to earlier. The girls of Team RWBY are mostly just one-dimensional husks by now, despite being the supposed protagonists and being 8 volumes in. The only member of the team with any real character development is Weiss, and even then, she's basically the exact same character she's been since volume 4. This unwillingness to have Team RWBY being the ones to push the plot forward just leaves our supposed protagonists as empty vessels, with barely any semblance of agency, and mindlessly does whatever the plot compels them to, so the side characters RT actually gives focus to a chance to grow. This also means that countless times throughout the series, the only character who has any sense of agency, underlying motivations for their actions, or just makes substantial choices in the main plot are done by the side characters. Whenever they're put in a situation where they're forced to make decisions, it more often than not results in just outside forces making choices for them, or they end up doing something completely unrelated. I have more evidence to add to this, but I'll touch on it later. For now, let's progress onto our charts and counters. Part 2H, Episode 8. Episode 8, Dark, begins with Crow waking up to the sound of rumbling. He looks around to see Watts twiddling his thumbs and Jock nervously hugging himself. Robin says, "Yep, not getting much sleep in here either." She says it sounds bad out there as Crow sits up and places his hand on his forehead. As the rumbling grows louder, Crow says, "Wait, that doesn't sound like," before the wall is blown open. Crow shouts for them to get down as a shockwave flies past them. As Robin tries to orient herself, Crow, in bird form, calls at her before the ceiling caves in on them. With a heartbeat pounding in her ear, Nora slowly begins to awaken. She sees the lightning scars on her arm as Klein tells her she's going to be fine. She looks over as Blake opens the door for RWBY, Weiss, and Whitley, who carry in the unconscious Penny. Blake mentions Penny falling unconscious and leaking as Klein instructs them to set her down on the smaller bed. Whitley holds up his arms and sighs as his clothes are covered in Penny's oil. RWBY and Weiss glance down at themselves, seeing the same thing.
RWBY then asks Klein if he can help Penny. As Klein scans her with his scroll, he mentions that he barely knows what she even is, but as her anatomy is similar enough, he can stitch up her wound. There's a large explosion outside which catches everyone's attention before it cuts off the power. Whitley says that's rich, as May calls in asking if everyone's okay, saying another bombing run has lit up the kingdom. RWBY says that part of the city has lost power, but they're fine. May apologizes for not staying, but time is running out for everyone in the crater. RWBY apologizes herself, saying once they figure out what's wrong with Penny, they'll do something. Out of her window, May sees a sentinel ripping a flagship in half and tells RWBY not to beat herself up, saying that, at this point, I don't know what's left to be done. RWBY says that this is all too much as Weiss places her hand on her shoulder. The Grimm, the crater, Nora, Penny, how do we fix it all? Klein then sneezes, catching their attention. One step at a time, he says before switching back to his main personality. You can't worry about fixing everything. Simply focus on what's in front of you. If you'd like someplace to start, I'd be able to work faster if you could get the power back on. RWBY starts asking how they would do that, as Willow, leaning against the frame with a wine bottle in hand, says they have a generator at the edge of the estate. They all look at her as Whitley says, it's so kind for you to join us, Mother. Willow retorts saying that, believe it or not, I'm above drinking in the dark. She notices Klein and greets him. There's a brief moment of silence before Weiss states that the STC executives have their own auxiliary generators in case of citywide blackouts, and that even though they're extremely unfair, it's not a bad time to have company perks. Wow, thanks Weiss for breaking the tension and immersion by expositing at us in a way that sounds almost like she's read it straight out of a Wiki article. My problem isn't necessarily that this information is redundant, even though Willow literally just explained that they have a generator. My problems with it are that it's unnecessary, as it's not hard to imagine the richest and most powerful family in Atlas would have a backup generator in a kingdom located in the middle of a tundra. It's just a piece of world building that's exposited and adds no value to the scene. And because it's written without any consideration for the context of the scene and devoid of any sort of character. Does Weiss not care how her mother treats Klein? Did Willow have any part in kicking him out? Who cares? Not RT, clearly.
It's a cartoon!
The only conscious person in that room who wouldn't know that information is RWBY. And why would she care why they have auxiliary generators in this moment? Sure, this leads to Whitley's epiphany that they control the company, but could they have not gotten to the same place with a less contrived piece of dialogue? Either way, Whitley then realizes that since they control the company, they can use the company's cargo ships, which have been sitting around due to the embargo, to evacuate the civilians in the crater. Weiss adds that they control the drones too, like the ones at Snowshoe Shipping. Blake asks if we can, and Whitley corrects her that he can, as he has access to Jock's computer. RWBY happily exclaims that they definitely need to get the power on then. I actually really like their plan here. As clunky as the road to it was, it utilizes not only something set up earlier in the volume and the previously established embargo, it gives more value to RWBY's team ending up at Weiss's home, rather than just being the place where most of the second half of the volume takes place. That being said, it doesn't negate my previous criticism that Whitley is the one who comes up with this idea. Would it really have been that hard for Weiss to be the one to say it, and then Whitley just tacks onto it later? Would it be so hard to at least try and indicate that these characters actually have any sense of agency? Please, for my sake if nothing else. To be clear here, of course at the end of the day, they're all fictional characters, and the choices that they make ultimately are made by the writers. However, there's a significant difference between a character doing something because the writers made them to do so, and a character doing so because of their own personal goals, convictions, or values, etc. Even if it serves the aims of the writers on a more technical level. As well, a character having agency does not necessarily mean they do the right thing, per se. Just that their actions are character-driven, rather than plot-driven. Like, let's flash back to the Battle of Beacon for a minute. Even before it properly began, RWBY was actively pushing the plot forward. Upon noticing Emerald and Amity, despite supposedly being on her way back to Mistral, RWBY takes the initiative to investigate, leading to her running into Mercury and realizing the deception. Despite being unable to stop the fight in time, and while grieving Penny's death, RWBY is still the first one to act when the Nevermore broke into Amity, charging headfirst to save Pyrrha with just one of Penny's swords. Then, after Ironwood's speech, RWBY again takes the initiative by boarding Roman's commandeered airship to face off with him and Neo alone. After that, she regroups with the rest of her team and leads Weiss in the search for John and Pyrrha. In contrast, throughout the whole Atlas arc, the only choices she makes here are either inconsequential ones that just happen to plop her wherever the next plot beat happens to take place, a la choosing to go to Robin's election party, ones made alongside and or are then carried out by other characters, a la Oscar and RWBY deciding in unison to tell Ironwood the truth, with him being the one to do so. Our non-choices, a la give Penny to Salem up or don't, once they contradict her actions and or motivations up to that point, a la not trusting Ironwood despite, well, I couldn't think of a way to phrase this that didn't just come off as ripping off Twiins Inc.'s video on Ironwood, so I'll let them explain it themselves. And if you haven't already, you absolutely should watch that video yourself. I'll leave a link to it in the description and in the iCard if I remember.
Despite losing their shit on Ozpin for not telling them that Salem can't be killed, the kids insist on lying to the man that they want as their ally a ton. They lie about how many questions the lamp has left, they lie about Ozpin hiding from them after they punched him and Oscar in the face, They don't even tell James what they had learned from the lamp when they used it. All this lying despite Ironwood immediately opening up to the kids and telling them literally everything, his entire plan. He even returns the lamp back to them, a decision that ends up getting the relic stolen. So why? Because Team RWBY don't know if they can trust him yet, even though he gives the kids their licenses, gave Yang her new state-of-the-art arm for free, helped fight alongside Crow when Beacon was under attack, gave Pietro the funding and resources he needed to revive Penny, defended Weiss at the party. Oh, but he had the Aesops arrest the kids when they showed up. In a stolen airship. So that makes him bad.
Ones made while ignoring viable alternatives because the plot demanded them not to be up until the point where they were, a la, we can't use the staff, except when we do, and solve the entire arc's conflict in the span of at most a few hours of plot time. Or Silver Eyes on Monstra? Nah, definitely not worth thinking about. It cuts to a shot of the moon before cutting again to Blake and RWBY running towards the generator. They make it inside and RWBY starts it up. RWBY anxiously goads it to start working. Blake tells her not to worry and that it'll work. RWBY dismissively says that nothing else has. To which Blake then says, I know you don't always know what to do, but that's never stopped you from doing something. I was like that as a girl, but time and other things took their toll on me. Then I wasn't sure if that kind of girl could survive in this world. Until I met you. It was a little strange at first because you were younger, but I've always looked up to you, RWBY, and I still do. RWBY smiles and sheds a tear. She then thanks Blake as the generator turns on. Blake's speech is extremely jarring to me, as Blake really hasn't shown any real interest in RWBY as someone to look up to. You could argue that her description of RWBY as the embodiment of purity in Volume 4 could allude to that, but the fact that RWBY and Blake have had so few interactions together and even fewer that are deeper than surface level advice or small talk, that this speech feels so out of character. Plus, it's another example of the show telling us what someone feels rather than, showing us what they feel. Regardless, the lights activate across the manor, and Whitley and Weiss, waiting in Jock's study, notice Jock's computer activating. Whitley immediately goes to log in, as it cuts back to Blake, staring in fear as the Hound can be seen from the window behind RWBY. This is a great shot, immediately establishing that the Hound is here and putting the audience on high alert. Inside, Willow and Klein sit as the window is shattered. Klein asks what it is as Willow reaches for her bottle. She hesitates briefly as lightning strikes. Her hand trembles before she grabs it. Another beautiful shot, clearly showing Willow's mindset in just one short scene. Weiss calls to Blake and RWBY. Blake warns her about the Hound before shouting at RWBY to look out. Quickly realizing that she's needed elsewhere, Weiss asks Whitley if he can handle this, prompting him to snarkily respond, assuming you can handle that. Weiss groans as she starts leaving, saying they'll need to work on his attitude. It then cuts to RWBY again being thrown out of a hole in the generator room, with the Hound slowly approaching. It growls at her as Blake jumps from overhead, but is grabbed and thrown away. The Hound pounces at RWBY, who speeds away to Blake's side with her Semblance. She asks what it is, but Blake says it's just a Grimm before charging at it. Blake tells her to focus as she fires a few pot shots with Gamble's Shroud. RWBY closes her eyes and takes a deep breath. Blake goes in for another strike, but is smacked away. The Hound turns its attention to RWBY for saying, "Take the girl." It pounces at RWBY again, slamming her into the ground and flashing her aura. Come on, RWBY. You were literally just standing there as it pounced. Compared to being thrown through a solid wall, being pinned like she was much less damaging to her. And I thought being knocked out was something that couldn't happen while you have aura. And why don't we get a reaction from them as it speaks? Blake calls out to RWBY as the Hound sprouts wings again. It begins to fly away, but Blake ties one half of Gamble's Shroud around its leg and anchors herself to the ground with the other. Weiss arrives and radios in to Klein, informing him of the Hound and telling them to stick together, and call if others arrive. Klein confirms as Will tries to pour herself into the glass. She drops both the glass and the bottle, which shattered on the ground. She gasps as her arms uncontrollably shiver. Klein tries to calm her as Petty awakes, eyes blood red. Willow runs out, saying she can't do this, as Klein reaches out to her. He calls for her to come back as Penny stands up. He turns to see Penny standing and tries to tell her to take it easy, but is thrown into the chair. Penny starts to walk forward, but her green eyes and maiden powers activate as she struggles to stop herself. She screams, "No, not again," as a vortex of green energy swirls around her. It cuts back to Weiss shooting icicles at the Hounds, which miss. She tries to summon a Nevermore, but it's killed as several sentinels emerge from the ground. This causes Blake to lose her grip on the Hound, which breaks free. As it flies upward, it notices Penny's light from the manor. RWBY awakens, sees the Hound holding her, and looks down at the blood on her outfit, shouting to Weiss and Blake that it's after Penny and not her. The Hound drops RWBY. Weiss calls out to her, but RWBY crashes in the ground and her aura shatters, falling unconscious again in the process. So RWBY got knocked out for 2 minutes, only to wake up, exposit information that Blake and Weiss could figure it out themselves, to then be dropped and knocked out again. Man, I'm on the edge of my seat right now. Blake commands Weiss to help the others, and that she has RWBY. Weiss then charges towards the manor. Blake runs towards RWBY, but is interrupted as a centaur digs its way out of the ground.
So I want to pause here because this new Grimm sparks a lot of questions in my mind. Are we supposed to assume that this is one of the Grimm that Dr. Merlot created from Grimm Eclipse? I'd guess the answer is no, given that it still has red accents and eyes rather than the green that all of Dr. Merlot's had, but it leads to an even bigger question. Why haven't we seen him or any of his Grimm since that time? I'm sure that since Salem is experimenting with Grimm, she'd be interested in working with someone who's not only succeeded in making their Grimm stronger, but has also given them new abilities.
Ow.
No!
I was about to say I'm gonna die, but I'm already there. So.
They fucking stun lock you, it's so bullshit.
As far as we know, he managed to escape from his lab after self-destructing it, and now it's been 5.5 volumes since Grimm Eclipse took place, or like a year's worth of story time. What the hell has he been doing since then? I'm not gonna add this to the counters, as it's not necessarily a problem with Volume 8, but seriously, Rooster Teeth, if you're gonna insist these games are canon...
Yeah, it's been fun going over the script with you guys and seeing like what y'all have in store, what kind of game types they're gonna be.
Yeah, so you guys are coordinating about story elements and things to put in the game, and how, you know, there might be some little bit of, you know, hints of things that cross over between it and the show and stuff like that.
Is it too much to ask that you actually consider the effects they have on the canon, or are we just supposed to assume that all of the side content is canon adjacent now? And don't think I forgot about you, Arrowfell. It then cuts to Penny struggling against the virus. Klein tells her that she's okay, pleading for her to calm down. Penny says she doesn't want to do it, as Nora shakily grabs her hand. Penny pauses and looks towards Nora. No one's gonna make you do anything you don't want to, Nora says. Penny rebuts, saying, a part of me is making me, but Nora cuts her off, saying, it's just a part of you. Don't forget about the rest. Penny manages to settle down and kneels by Nora's side. Man, is it refreshing to see some setup actually being paid off. Seriously, most of Nora's scenes in this volume have just been great. Unequivocally great. Weiss then calls Klein to warn him of the Hound approaching, to stay quiet, and that she's on her way. Klein asks her to hurry as Whitley and Willow haven't returned. Weiss then asks him where Willow had went as it cuts to her presumably entering her room, and running for another bottle of vodka on her desk. She reaches for it, but stops herself momentarily before screaming as the Hound breaks into the main room. Is there a reason why the Hound doesn't just charge into Weiss's room? It could see Penny's lights going off, and it clearly has no regards for bursting into windows. It retracts its wings and starts to sniff for Penny. It catches her scent and slowly crawls towards some of her oil that leaked in the ground earlier. It briefly cuts to Nora and Penny before cutting to Weiss again as she enters. She slowly looks around before Willow calls Weiss and shouting, above you! The Hound jumps down and slams Weiss into the piano, flashing her aura. It slowly approaches for a moment before catching Penny's scent again and leaving. So I get that the Hound is intelligent and all, but why did it try to ambush Weiss when it clearly just cares about Penny and doesn't deem Weiss to be a threat? Weiss tepidly calls to Willow as it cuts to a second bottle shattered on the floor, and Willow looking through the security cameras on her scroll. I'm really glad that Willow's cameras make a comeback in this volume, as well as characterizing Willow as someone who puts her children above her alcohol addiction. Not much, but something. Willow tells Weiss that she can see the Hound outside of Winter's old room, asking if Weiss can kill it. Weiss asks what it's doing. Willow says she isn't sure before asking why it's here. Weiss responds that it doesn't matter and to keep an eye on it so she can track it down. Willow takes a deep breath and says that it's moving again. As she realizes where it's going, she begins to freak out again before it cuts to the oil on Whitley's clothes. While I do think it's dumb that the Hound doesn't immediately go for Penny, I do love this shot. They've established it's now tracking via smell, and just like Weiss and RWBY, Whitley is covered in Penny's oil. As Whitley is finishing up, Willow calls to him. He snarks that she's the last thing he needs right now. The door opens and Whitley angrily groans before realizing who's there. The Hound walks in as it shows Whitley hiding behind Jock's desk. He peeks out from the side and notices the Hound approaching as Jock's terminal says, "Credentials verified. Click to proceed." The Hound is shown getting even closer to Whitley as it says, "I know you're here." Obviously, this terrifies Whitley. Before it can find him, a summoned Borbitusk charges into it, and Willow screams for Whitley to run. He does, but quickly doubles back to press the proceed button. Another great moment for Willow. Along with proving she can use her glyphs as well, it's another point in favor of Willow putting her kids above her alcoholism. Again, not much, but something. The two run, closely being pursued by the Hound. Before it's able to catch them, Weiss arrives and raises the wall of ice between them. She reassuringly says, "I didn't forget you." Alright, I admit, that was a cute line. I also appreciate the callback to Weiss and Willow's conversation from the last volume. However, it's undermined somewhat due to the lack of a through line between that scene and this scene. If only there was a scene where, where Willow could have expressed her concern of how Weiss was treating Whitley since she'd come back. It'd pair very well to a comeback of Weiss accusing Willow of mistreating and or being involved in Klein being fired. Oh well. Before any of them have a chance to revel in that, the Hound cracks the ice wall. Weiss orders Whitley and Willow to run as she stands ready to fight. As Willow walks past, she briefly pauses and places a hand on Weiss's shoulder. Weiss looks over and nods before Willow continues running. Weiss begins to summon as it cuts to Blake dueling the centaur. After avoiding one strike, Blake asks why the Grimm just get more disgusting. It then spits acid at her, which Blake manages to evade relatively easily. She then starts to talk to RWBY while fighting, saying, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you, RWBY. We all need you." The centaur then spits acid at her, which Blake avoids with a fire dust boosted use of her semblance. She goes in for another strike, but is grabbed and slammed into the ground. It tries to stab into her, but Blake avoids it by forcing it to stab an ice clone. Blake goes in for another strike, but is smacked away by the ice clone and slammed into the wall, causing her ore to flash. Blake struggles to catch her breath as she begs for RWBY to get up. The centaur grabs her, and before it can finish her off, RWBY kills it. RWBY chuckles before saying, "I could hear you." So ignoring the lack of any sign of life from RWBY before she kills the centaur, I want to circle back to RWBY's cycle of consciousness. She was knocked out by a single tackle that didn't even break her aura. She wakes up just to deliver exposition that was unnecessary, only to be immediately knocked out again, and then wakes up again off screen to save Blake at the last second. Like, on the surface, I don't think RWBY saving Blake here is a bad thing, but the fact that her state of consciousness shifts only as the plot needs it to just makes it hard for there to be any sort of tension in this scene at all. As soon as Blake started talking to RWBY, I already knew it was going to end this way. Not because I'm some genius or anything, but because the last second save trope has done so much in this show, RWBY's Schrödinger's consciousness, and having Blake lose or die here would necessitate a massive shift in the trajectory of the current plot, that I knew RT wasn't going to do it. Blake sighs in relief as RWBY picks her up. They both hear Penny scream from inside. It cuts to Weiss and the Hound. The Hound, hearing the scream, turns and runs towards Penny, prompting Weiss to desummon her knight and alert Klein that it's coming. Back in Weiss's room, Penny grasps her head and apologizes as she loses control of herself. With that, she stands, pushes Klein aside, and exits. It cuts to Whitley and Willow at the main staircase, stopping to catch their breath as Whitley sees Penny walking past. He calls out to her, asking what she's doing, to which Penny calmly states, "I must open the vault and self-terminate." The Hound lunges at her, but Penny manages to stop it. The Hound then sprouts another arm, grabs Penny by the head, and slams her repeatedly into the ground while saying, "Take the girl." RWBY, Blake, and Weiss regroup at the bottom of the staircase. RWBY calls out to Penny, but the Hound holds her up with a nail at her throat. RWBY angrily states, "That's enough," before blasting it with her silver eyes. The Hound stumbles back through the window, dropping Penny in the process. Penny tumbles to the first floor with RWBY, Weiss, and Blake rushing to her side. As they tend to her, the Hound pulls itself back up. Its grim head has been blasted off, revealing a male silver-eyed faunus underneath, still repeating the "take the girl" line. A white tumor-like growth covers the right side of his face, black grim liquid leaks from his eye and ear, several white pustule growths are dotted around, and some of the muscle on his chin and neck are exposed. RWBY stares at him, horrified. The three move back towards the wall, with Weiss and Blake carrying Penny as the Hound's grim head begins to reform. Before the Hound can pounce at them, Willow and Whitley shove one of the knight statues, crushing the Hound underneath it. As the dust clears, only the Hound's arm is seen. The grim parts fade away, revealing the petrified arm skeleton of the silver-eyed faunus underneath. RWBY falls to her knees as Weiss asks what it was. RWBY, visibly trying to wrap her head around that question herself, states, "It was a person," before fading to black. Okay, before we get to our charts and counters, I have some thoughts about this reveal and its implications for the series moving forward. Also, I have issues with how Penny is portrayed in the scene, but I'll touch on that when Penny's plotline becomes relevant again. Back to my point, I think that, in of itself, the Hound being a silver-eyed warrior is a great idea. Silver-eyed warriors have been described as natural warriors, as I alluded to last episode. As a quick aside, it was pointed out to me in the comments that they're not natural leaders. I had misremembered Quo's description of them in the Volume 3 finale. I won't retract the points I gave that scene, though. Even without that piece of lore, it was still a good scene. Anyways, I also really appreciate that the silver-eyed warrior here is a faunus, which confirms what we had already assumed to be true in a really natural way. It also makes me wonder if the reason the Hound was a Hound to begin with is in any way related to the fact that the host was, presumably, a dog faunus. However, my main issue here, essentially, is the duplicitous nature of the importance of silver eyes. The long and short of it is that silver eyes act as nothing more than a pseudo deus ex machina to be used whenever the plot demands, rather than being an aspect of RWBY Rose as a character. So, now that we're here with the Hound being revealed as a silver-eyed Grimm hybrid, let's talk about it. That has massive ripple effects for the series' lore and raises a lot of questions, such as, when did Salem decide to start capturing and experimenting on silver-eyed warriors? How was she able to keep them in prison when they, by default, can one-shot any of her small fry? Is there a reason the Hound is the seemingly first successful hybrid Salem's made? Does she still have silver-eyed warriors in prison somewhere? Does that mean Summer Rose is still alive? Has she been turned into a hybrid? Well, for that last one, apparently so, but we'll get to that later. For now, though, this is the end of our coverage for today. Here are updated charts and counters.
And before I close today, I just want to say thank you to all my subscribers and anyone else who actually sat through this entire video. I know this has been a long time coming. It's been a long, crazy year for me, and I really appreciate you sticking around and being patient with me as I got this video finished. But it's a new year and I have a lot of plans for 2023, so I hope you stick around to see them all. Like always, thank you to BerwinX and half_sure for making this video possible. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.